everyone. So it's time for us to move on to chapter 9. And if you are watching this in the fall of 2020, you should be watching this around September 14th, Monday, September 14th, or Tuesday, September 15th. A few announcements for my students who are taking this entirely online. Don't forget that you have a quiz this Friday. Okay. On that quiz, I will be covering chapters 8 and 9. And both of these are doozies. So I highly recommend that you go ahead and get started studying now. I would say chapter 9 may be the hardest chapter that we cover this semester, but I'm going to walk you through it step by step. So I think you're going to be just fine. All right, so in our last chapter, we talked about enzymes, right? And we talked about how enzymes catalyze chemical reactions, right? In this chapter, we're going to be focusing on one of the most important set of chemical reactions that these enzymes can catalyze, and that is the set of reactions that use glucose as an energy source. So we're going to use glucose as an energy source, okay? And what we're going to do is use enzymes to perform a series of chemical reactions to ultimately convert this glucose into ATP. Now, why ATP? Well, glucose has some chemical bonds that store energy for us, but ATP is really, I like to think of it as the money of the cell, okay? ATP is the molecule that we really use within the cell as an energy storage reservoir and as the energy currency of the cell, okay? Now, in thinking about how we can go from glucose to ATP, we have two options. This first one here, cellular respiration, is also known as aerobic respiration. And what aerobic means is in the presence or with oxygen. So cellular respiration is the action of turning glucose into ATP with oxygen hanging around. And the importance of this oxygen is it allows us to get a lot of ATP, from glucose. Now, fermentation, this is one, I'm going to put one here. Fermentation, right here, is a second way to go from glucose to ATP. But this is also known as anaerobic respiration. That means without oxygen. So we can do this just a little bit. Bacteria do this often a lot. And the thing is, if you're trying to turn glucose into ATP and you don't have oxygen to help with these chemical reactions, you can still do it, but you're just going to get a little bit of ATP from your glucose. From So just to recap, basically what we're going to do is use a series of enzymes in both of these processes, cellular respiration and fermentation. The goal of both of these processes is to use enzymes to turn glucose into ATP, because ATP is really what I like to call the money of the cell. It's what we use as our energy storage molecule. Cellular respiration turns glucose into ATP with the help of oxygen. If we have oxygen around, then we can get a lot of ATP for each molecule of glucose. But even without oxygen, we can still turn glucose into ATP using fermentation, which is a type of anaerobic respiration, meaning without oxygen. But if we don't have oxygen around, we're going to get a whole lot less ATP from our glucose molecule, okay? So let's think about what this chapter is going to cover. The key concepts in this chapter: first, how cells produce ATP when oxygen is present. That is the process of cellular respiration. Okay, cellular respiration occurs in 4 steps, and we're going to break these down one by one so that you don't become confused. The 4 steps are glycolysis, pyruvate oxidation, sometimes called pyruvate processing in your book. All right. The citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. Okay, so this all requires oxygen and is called cellular respiration. Now, we're also going to learn at the very end of the chapter, we're going to spend most of our time here, okay? At the very end of the chapter, we're going to talk about this: how cells can turn glucose into ATP when there is no oxygen, when oxygen is absent. And it turns out that that's going to happen in 2 steps: glycolysis and then a process called fermentation. Notice that this first step is the same for both, okay? So this process we are going to call fermentation. And just as a vocabulary recap, cellular respiration is also known as aerobic, meaning that it occurs with oxygen. Fermentation is one form of anaerobic respiration. Oops, hold on, let me spell that correctly for you. Come on, eraser, there we go. Anaerobic respiration. Meaning without oxygen, okay? So I'm going to be breaking this chapter down into 2 parts. The first part is really going to be some background information just to get you oriented, and we're going to focus on this first process here, cellular respiration, okay? The second part of the lecture is going to look at each of these processes individually and give you a little introduction to glycolysis and fermentation, okay? And at the end of that, that is what will be on your quiz along with chapter 8, okay? So chapter 8 and 9 on your quiz on Friday. All right, a few things to think about. So what we are doing here is we are trying to get energy from glucose. What we're trying to do is turn glucose into ATP, okay? And this is something that is happening all the time in your cells, because it turns out that at any given moment in time, you only have enough ATP in your cells to drive the chemical reactions of your cells for about 30 seconds. After that, you run out, all right? You run out of ATP if you're not making more. It turns out that cells do not store ATP. They don't store ATP, so they are constantly making it. Constant synthesis. Okay, these guys are always making ATP, because if they didn't, after 30 seconds, your cell would be out of ATP and the cell would die, right? So in order to avoid this, we are constantly making ATP, okay? And if we're talking about cellular respiration, and I'm just going to put cell resp, Remember that cellular respiration is aerobic and it requires oxygen. So this is why you breathe, guys. This is why you breathe oxygen. You breathe oxygen so that you can turn glucose into a lot of ATP, okay? That is the whole reason, come on there we go. So that you can turn glucose into a lot of ATP. Now, let's see here what I want to tell you guys next. The other thing is you breathe in the oxygen, and then what we're going to give off after cellular respiration is all done, our waste of this process is going to be carbon dioxide. So you guys know that you breathe in oxygen. The reason you breathe in oxygen is to drive cellular respiration. After cellular respiration has broken down glucose, you're going to give off carbon dioxide as the waste product. So this is why you see O2 going into the lungs and CO2 coming out of the lungs, all right? Now let's take a look chemically at what's happening during cellular respiration. Here we have a molecule of glucose, and we can actually write this as C6H12O6, right? And I told you that cellular respiration needs oxygen, and we're actually going to use 6 molecules of oxygen, okay? What's going to happen during cellular respiration is that we're going to break down this glucose molecule and combine it with this oxygen to form 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters. And if you count all of this, all of it should balance. So we've got 6 carbons on this side of the equation. If you look over here, we have 6 carbons on this side of the equation, all right? We have 12 hydrogens here. Let's go over here. We've got 6 of these H2s. Well, 6 times 2, that's 12, okay? We have 6 O2s here, 6 O2s here. We've got 6 O's here, and if you look, we've got 6 O's here. Everything balances out. We just rearranged some things. As a matter of fact, we have rearranged these things in an oxidation reduction reaction or a redox reaction, okay? And remember that oxidation is loss and reduction is gain. So let's look at what's being oxidized and what's being reduced in this example. And one way to understand, when I said oxidation is loss and reduction is gain, what we're talking about is electrons. So in an oxidation reaction, you're losing electrons, and in a reduction reaction, you're gaining electrons. But electrons rarely travel by themselves. So one way to track what's being oxidized and what's being reduced, I always say, follow the hydrogens. Here's what I mean, okay? So a hydrogen, 1 proton, 1 electron. So we can think of that as the electron that's moving around, okay? Let's look here at the carbons in glucose. If we go from glucose here to carbon dioxide here, you can see that we have lost these hydrogens. So glucose is being oxidized into carbon dioxide here, okay? Let's look at the oxygen. Oxygen gains some H's, doesn't it? So the oxygen is being reduced. Now, why is it important for us to understand oxidation reduction reactions? Well, the big deal is that oxidation reactions, they give off energy, okay? So the process of losing an electron gives off energy that we can use to do work in the cell, okay? This work can be other chemical reactions, and we're actually going to use this energy of oxidation to do work to help us make ATP a little bit later. So if we look at this very simplified equation, we have glucose plus 6 oxygen. Glucose is oxidized into carbon dioxide. Oxygen is reduced into water, and this action of oxidizing glucose here to here gives us some energy that we can use to do work in the cell, okay? Now, this process of going through all of these chemical reactions, as we learn more and more details about how this happens, we're going to see that these chemical reactions are also going to give off some byproducts, okay? All right, let me show you what the byproducts that I want us to pay attention to are, okay? The 2 byproducts that I want us to pay attention to are called FADH2 and NADH, okay? And the actual names for these are in your notes. One is called flavin adenine dinucleotide, and this is called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. I will tell you honestly, I always have to look these names up. I'm not going to ask you to know their full names. I want you to know their chemical names, FADH2 and NADH. Now, what happens as we are undergoing this chemical reaction, so C6H12O6 plus 6O2 goes to 6CO2 plus 6H2O. All right, as we are undergoing this complete oxidation of glucose, some of the reactions that glucose undergoes to get from here to here are going to take this molecule, FAD, and turn it into FADH2. Let's follow the hydrogens. We gained hydrogens here, didn't we? So these hydrogens that have been gained carry electrons with them, don't they? These are high energy electron carriers. Undergoing this set of reactions also takes this NAD molecule and sticks some hydrogens on it. The hydrogens have electrons with them. So this NADH molecule is a high energy electron carrier. Okay, so these electron carriers are going to be really important because you see, we've loaded these molecules with some electrons. Now, if we oxidize them, if we peel these electrons off and they lose their H's and therefore lose their electrons, then that's going to give off energy later on, right? This is like stored energy. This is like stored energy. And we're actually going to use these guys to help us in our process of making ATP, okay? So these high energy electron carriers are byproducts of this process. They store energy in the form of these electrons. If we break these bonds, they give off energy that we can use later on to make ATP. And I'm going to show you guys how that happens, okay? All right. Now, let's see here. What did I want to tell you here? So what I want us to start with here is I want us to look at an overview of the 4 steps to cellular respiration. Okay, this is an overview of our 4 steps. Okay, so the first step that I want you to know about is called glycolysis. Okay, glycolysis, if you were to break this word down, it literally means sugar break, right? That's literally what those word parts mean. So in glycolysis, what we're doing is we are taking a molecule of glucose, and I'm going to draw it with 6 little dots. Each of these dots I'm going to use to represent a carbon. So glucose has 6 carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dots. Okay, so in glycolysis, what we're doing is we're taking a glucose and we're breaking it into 2 3-carbon molecules, okay? These 3-carbon molecules have a name. Each one is called a pyruvate molecule. Okay, so that's what happens first in our cellular respiration cascade of events, okay? So we went from 1 molecule of glucose here, and you can see that we have 2 molecules of pyruvate, but it's still 6 carbons, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right, I'm gonna erase those numbers so we don't get that confused with our steps, because the next step in this process is called pyruvate processing or pyruvate oxidation. Okay, in pyruvate oxidation, what happens is we're going to go from 2 3-carbon pyruvates to 2, and I'm going to draw lines here so we know that these are all connected to one another, just in case that gets a little confusing. All right, these are all connected. Okay, so we're going to go from 2 3-carbon sugars called pyruvate to 2 2-carbon sugars that are attached to another molecule called CoA, okay? So these are 2 molecules of acetyl CoA, okay? Now we've lost some carbons, haven't we? We've actually lost 1 off of each of these molecules, and we lose that in the form of CO2. So we're going to lose 2 CO2 molecules here for 2 carbons, all right? So that's the next thing that happens. We start out, we break glucose into half, and we have 2 3-carbon sugars called pyruvate. That's step 1. Then in step 2, we break pyruvate, and we get 2 2-carbon molecules, and we lose 2 CO2s, which are each 1 carbon apiece, okay? So keeping up with the carbons, we still have 6, but we've just lost 2 of them, and you're gonna exhale those, okay? The next step is going to take these acetyl-CoA molecules, and it's going to put them into a very famous set of biochemical reactions that you've probably heard of, called the citric acid cycle. So that's step 3. Okay, and what's going to happen is this for each acetyl-CoA that goes in, you're going to lose 2 carbon dioxide. So if you have 2 acetyl-CoA go in, or sorry, if you have 1 acetyl-CoA go in, you're going to lose 2 carbon dioxide, and then the second one, you'll lose 2 carbon dioxide. So you're eventually going to lose 4 carbon dioxide, okay? So each time this goes around with a molecule of acetyl-CoA going into this set of reactions, you lose 2 CO2. So if it does it twice, you ultimately lose 4 CO2. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, if you're keeping up with our carbons, you realize at this point, we've gotten rid of all of the carbon from glucose. We started out with 6 here. We had 3, we lost 2. We had 4, we lost 4. These get breathed out of your lungs, okay? So now the glucose is all gone. What's gonna happen next? Well, remember, I told you that this whole process is gonna generate some byproducts, right? It's gonna generate those high energy electron carriers. So the very next thing that's going to happen is our electron carriers, they are going to go to the 4th step, which you've probably heard of. It's called the electron transport chain, okay? And it is ultimately going to generate ATP, okay? So this is an overview of our 4 steps. Now we're gonna go into detail as to how each of these things happens, but I wanted you to kind of see what the process looks like from a very bird's eye perspective, okay? Now, a couple things that I wanna point out for you. I'm just gonna draw a line here. This part of the process here is actually happening in the cytoplasm, okay? So the enzymes to make these processes occur all exist in the cytoplasm. But once we get to these 2 3-carbon sugars called pyruvate, the pyruvate gets moved into the mitochondria. Okay, so everything here is happening in the mitochondria. So the ATP are being generated in the mitochondria because y'all know that mitochondria are, of course, the powerhouse of the cell, right? Because their whole job is to make ATP. Okay? So let's look at this process a little more closely. This is basically what I just drew for you, but let's walk through it together because this includes our byproducts, okay, as well as the ATP that's being made, okay? So let's look at this a little more closely. We're going to start out with glucose. Again, 6 carbons. And I'm going to draw a line through so we know that they're all linked together, okay? It's a 6-carbon molecule. The first thing that happens is glycolysis is going to break glucose into pyruvate, which remember, pyruvate is 3 carbons, okay? So we've gone from 6 to 2 3-carbon molecules, right? In the process of going from here to here, we generate one of our high energy electron carriers, and we also generate a little bit of ATP, and I'll show you how much we get out of these guys, okay? The next thing that's gonna happen is the pyruvate is going to move into the mitochondria. So here, you can see that this is in the cytosol. We're gonna move into the mitochondria here, okay? So these guys move into the mitochondria, and as they're moving into the mitochondria, we're gonna peel off carbon dioxide and we're gonna generate some more high energy electron carriers, and we're gonna be left with these acetyl-CoA molecules, and I'm just gonna draw a little thing. That's an extra molecule that gets stuck on there, the CoA bit, okay? So we've lost 2 carbon dioxide, but we still have these carbons here. Each of these acetyl-CoAs are going to feed into this citric acid cycle, and for each one, we're going to lose 2 carbon dioxide. So 1 turn, 2 carbon dioxide, and then again, another 2 carbon dioxide. And at this point, we've used up the glucose, right? So no more glucose. Oh, that's a G, glucose. But what we've done is we've generated all of these high energy electron carriers. We can use these guys here in something called the electron transport chain, and it's going to generate ATP for us. Now, a couple things I want you to know. We make a couple of molecules of ATP here. We make a couple of molecules of ATP here, but where we really make the majority of our ATP is in the electron transport chain, okay? The other thing I wanted you to notice is oxygen is here in the electron transport chain. Basically, we're going to take these high energy electron carriers and we're going to peel the electrons off of them to give off energy to make this process go. But once we peel these electrons off, we need to have a place to dump them. So oxygen becomes, I call it the dumping ground for the electrons that we're going to use in this process, okay? All right. Another way of saying this is that oxygen is the final electron receptor in the electron transport chain. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. So I'm keeping this lecture relatively short because I want you to work through this overview because it's going to help you a great deal as you move forward with the rest of this lecture, which gets kind of complicated. So my recommendation to you is that you go back through, understand this chemical equation, be able to draw this, be able to understand this. Let's recap, okay? So the first thing that I want you to remember in thinking about an overview of this process is that cellular respiration's whole goal, the whole reason it exists, R-E-S-P, the whole reason it exists is to convert glucose into the currency that we use in the cell, which is ATP, okay? So that's point number one, all right? The second thing I want you to remember is that cellular respiration uses oxygen, right? And it gives off CO2. Oxygen is the final acceptor in the electron transport chain of those electrons, and CO2 is the waste product as we break down glucose. Third point. Glucose, as we break glucose down, and instead of saying break glucose down, I'm going to use the proper term. I'm going to say glucose oxidation creates byproducts. I'm going to put equals, I'm going to go just do an arrow, byproducts. And those byproducts are those high energy electron carriers. And those electron carriers were FADH2 and NADH. Okay. Point 4. We can peel off chemically speaking, we can peel off the electrons on the carriers and use that energy to make ATP. And remember that that process happens in the electron transport chain, okay? And I think that's it. Those are the main points that I want you to have. Now, what I want you to do is go draw. I want you to draw these diagrams that I have drawn for you, because if you understand this lecture, even though it's short, if you understand this lecture, then my next lecture is going to be much, much easier for you. So take a moment, spend some time with this information, draw these diagrams, and then you can move on to chapter 9, part 2. Good luck. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.